The first thing the army did was take his rifle away. That is how it started for the man who carried the M79. Somewhere in a training cycle at Fort Polk, or in a replacement company outside Bien Hoa, a sergeant would walk a line of 19-year-olds, stop in front of one of them, and point. Sometimes he picked the kid with the good throwing arm. Sometimes he picked the kid who was standing closest. Then that soldier handed over his M16 and received, in exchange, a short wooden-stocked tube that broke open like a farm shotgun and held exactly one round at a time. He was now the most destructive human being in his squad. He was also, from that moment forward, one of the most vulnerable, and everybody in the squad knew it, including him. There is a lot of romance around the M79. Collectors love it. Gun channels love it. It has one of the great nicknames in American military history, and a sound so distinctive that men who came home in 1969 were still flinching at it in 1999. But almost nothing you will find about this weapon deals honestly with the arrangement it forced on the person carrying it, which was, roughly, we are going to hand you the firepower of a small artillery piece. We are going to strap 50 pounds of live explosive to your chest. We are going to make you the #1 man the enemy wants dead, and for close-in defense of your own body, we are giving you a pistol designed in 1911. Then, on top of all that, we are going to build the weapon so it cannot save your life inside 30 meters. That last part is the piece nobody talks about, and we are going to get all the way into it. But start with the sound, because the sound is where the whole story lives. It was not a bang. A rifle cracks. A machine gun hammers. Artillery arrives like the sky tearing. The M79 made a sound like someone dropping a heavy book onto a mattress in the next room. A soft, hollow, almost comic thump. Thoop. Bloop. Men named it for that noise because soldiers always do. Thumper. Blooper. Bloop tube. Big Ed. The elephant gun. Australians in Phuoc Thai called it the wombat gun. It is the only weapon of the Vietnam War that got its nickname from being quiet. And then, after the thump, nothing. That is the part veterans describe when they describe it at all. Between the launch and the impact, there was a gap. 2 seconds, sometimes 3, occasionally 4 if you had put the round way out at maximum elevation. Long enough that in good light you could actually watch the grenade go, a dark speck rising off your shoulder and arcing over the elephant grass with all the urgency of a lobbed baseball. Long enough for men on both ends of that arc to have a complete thought. For the Americans, the thought was usually relief. For whoever was on the receiving end, once they learned the sound, it was something else entirely. There was no cover to find in 2 seconds. There was no shooting back at it. You heard a small hollow pop from somewhere in the tree line, and then you waited to learn whether the man who made it had done his math right. To understand why anybody built a weapon like this in the first place, you have to understand a problem the U.S. Army had been failing to solve since roughly 1918. An infantry squad in a firefight has 2 ways to deliver an explosion. It can throw a hand grenade, or it can call somebody else who has a tube. A fit soldier, standing up, with no gear on, in a parade ground, can throw a fragmentation grenade about 40 meters. Under fire, prone, in a rice paddy, wearing a rucksack, with his shoulder cramping. Call it 25, and pray it does not roll back. Meanwhile, the smallest mortar in the inventory had a minimum range measured in hundreds of meters. Fire it closer than that, and you are dropping shells on your own people, which leaves a hole. A dead band between roughly 40 meters and roughly 300 meters where the squad simply had no explosive answer. And here is the cruelty of it. That band is where infantry combat actually happens. Especially in terrain like Vietnam, where you could not see 300 meters if you climbed a tree. Most contacts in the Central Highlands or the Iron Triangle opened somewhere between 30 and 150 meters, which is to say, right in the middle of the hole. Everything the Army tried to fill that hole with was bad. Rifle grenades were the main attempt, and rifle grenades were miserable. You slid a finned bomb over the muzzle of your rifle, loaded a special blank cartridge, propped the butt against the ground or your hip, guessed the angle, and fired. The recoil could break your collarbone if you shouldered it. The accuracy was a rumor. You had to remember to swap cartridges, and if you forgot and fired a live round into the back of a grenade sitting on your muzzle, you found out what that felt like. So in 1952, the Army started something called Project Niblick. The goal was straightforward: a handheld weapon that could throw a real explosive charge farther than a man could throw, and more accurately than a rifle grenade, without needing a mortar crew, a base plate, or a fire direction center. The engineering problem was physics. To send a half-pound bomb out to 300 meters, you need a serious propellant charge. A serious propellant charge shoved through a shoulder-fired tube will shove back, and a human shoulder is not a good place to absorb that. The fix came from an idea German ordnance engineers had worked out during the Second World War, usually called the high-low propulsion system. The trick is to put the powder charge inside a small, thick-walled steel chamber sealed inside the base of the cartridge. When you fire, the powder burns in that little chamber at very high pressure, thousands of pounds per square inch, safely contained. Then the gas bleeds out through vent holes into the much larger volume of the cartridge case and the barrel behind the projectile. High pressure in a tiny space becomes low pressure in a big space. The grenade gets pushed out at about 75 meters per second, and the shooter gets a firm nudge instead of a broken clavicle. That is the entire secret of the thing. One clever cartridge design turned a mortar round into something a teenager could fire off his shoulder while standing in water. Springfield Armory built the launchers to go around it. They tried a 3-shot version, a strange sliding magazine design nicknamed the Harmonica, which actually made it to Vietnam in small numbers and jammed enough to kill the idea. They tried other configurations. In the end, the design that worked was almost insultingly simple: a break-open, single-shot, shoulder-fired tube called the S5 that looked exactly like an oversized single-barrel shotgun. The Army adopted it on the 15th of December, 1960. First deliveries went out in 1961. By the time American infantry battalions were arriving in force in 1965, there was one in every rifle squad, and there would be one in every rifle squad for the rest of the war. Pick it up, and the first thing that surprises you is how light it is. Loaded, about 6.5 pounds, 29 inches long. Aluminum receiver, wooden furniture, a rubber recoil pad on the butt that made the shoulder punch survivable. You pushed a lever on the right side with your thumb, the barrel hinged down, you dropped 140mm round into the breech with your left hand, and snapped it shut. 2 moving parts you had to care about. A child could learn the manual of arms in 10 minutes. There was a folding leaf sight, graduated in 25-meter increments out to 375, and a fixed blade sight for anything close. Almost nobody used the leaf sight after their first month in country. Real grenadiers fired the way a good outfielder throws to home plate, by feel, by memory, by watching where the last one landed and adjusting. They talked about it the way pitchers talk. You did not aim an M79. You threw with it. And the ones who were good at it were genuinely astonishing. There are accounts from all over the war of grenadiers putting rounds through bunker firing slits at 100 meters, dropping one into the open hatch of a spider hole, arcing a grenade over an intervening tree line onto a mortar crew they could not see, on the second shot, from memory. A rifle squad with a great blooper man had something no other squad had, which was an instant, private, personal artillery battery with a 2-second flight time and no radio call required. That was the whole appeal. Calling in real artillery took a radio, a grid coordinate, a fire mission request, somebody at the other end plotting it, guns laying, a spotting round, corrections. Minutes. In a firefight, minutes is a geological era. The grenadier heard his squad leader yell a direction and a distance, and the explosion happened before the sergeant finished the sentence. Men called the M79 the platoon leader's artillery, and they meant it literally. Now the trade. To carry it, you gave up your rifle. That was the doctrine, at least at first. The grenadier's personal defense weapon was the M1911A1 pistol. 7 rounds of .45 in the magazine, one in the chamber if you were the type. A magnificent handgun and completely, absurdly outclassed by an AK-47 at any distance past a card table. Try to sit inside that for a second. You are walking through triple canopy jungle where visibility drops to 15 meters, in a country where the enemy chooses when contact starts, and your primary weapon is a single-shot tube that has to be reloaded after every trigger pull, and your backup is a pistol with 8 rounds in it. Men solved this the way soldiers always solve institutional stupidity, unofficially. Grenadiers scrounged. They carried an M16 slung across their back, or a CAR-15 if they could sweet-talk it out of somebody, or in one memorable and widespread practice, they simply kept a rifle from a man who was not going to need it anymore. Company commanders looked the other way, because company commanders wanted their grenadiers alive. By the later years of the war, it was common for the blooper man to be humping his launcher, his ammunition, a rifle, magazines for the rifle, and the pistol, which is to say the Army's neat little equipment table had collapsed entirely under contact with reality. Now, what was he actually firing? This is where the M79 becomes something stranger and more versatile than most people realize, because the launcher was almost an afterthought. The real weapon system was the ammunition family, and there was a round for nearly everything. The standard was the M406 high explosive round, a stubby gold-colored projectile with a copper driving band around the base. On impact, it broke into more than 300 steel fragments moving outward at extraordinary speed, with a lethal radius of about 5 meters and a casualty radius considerably wider. That is the round that did most of the killing in this story. One man, one trigger pull, and everything inside a small courtyard is gone. Surgeons in the evacuation hospitals in Vietnam saw a lot of these wounds, and inside that inner radius, there was frequently nothing a surgeon could do. For close-in work, the Army first tried something called the fléchette round, which packed 45 tiny steel darts into a plastic case. Troops called it the beehive, because of the sound the darts made going downrange, a high whispering hiss. On paper, it was a nightmare weapon. In practice, it was almost useless. The fléchettes tumbled instead of flying point first, so instead of punching through a man, they smacked into him sideways and bounced off. There are accounts of grenadiers firing beehive rounds into charging enemy at 15 meters and watching them keep coming. So in 1966, the fléchette was replaced by the M576 buckshot round, which was exactly what it sounds like, a 40mm shotgun shell. 20 pellets, later versions with 27, packed in a plastic sabot. No fuse, no arming delay, nothing to go wrong. You pulled the trigger and a wall of lead left the muzzle immediately. At 15 meters, it was one of the most brutally effective close-range weapons in the American inventory, and it turned the grenadier's useless single-shot tube into a devastating trench gun for exactly one shot. The catch was range. The pattern opened up so fast that past 30 or 40 meters, you were essentially throwing gravel. The Army also experimented with a small steel insert that let a grenadier drop a commercial 12-gauge shotgun shell into his M79. It never went anywhere formally, but the fact that they tried tells you how badly the close-range problem itched. Then there was my personal candidate for the most quietly horrifying object of the entire war, the M397 airburst round. Standard tactical doctrine, when explosives start landing near you, is to get flat. Every army teaches it. Every soldier's body learns it in about 4 seconds of real combat. The M397 was designed specifically to punish that instinct. It hit the ground, and instead of detonating, it fired itself back up into the air, roughly 5 or 6 feet, and exploded above head height, throwing fragments downward. Onto the men lying in the dirt, doing exactly what they had been trained to do. Beyond the killing rounds, the M79 carried the squad's whole vocabulary. There were parachute illumination rounds that could hang a light over a night ambush position without anybody having to call the mortar section. Star clusters in different colors for signaling. Smoke rounds for marking targets for aircraft, which meant the grenadier was often the man who told a phantom pilot where to put the napalm. There were CS gas rounds for flushing tunnel complexes and bunkers. And by the end of the war, there were practice rounds, marking rounds, and a whole catalog of specialty munitions built around a cartridge that had originally been designed for one job. So the grenadier was not simply the squad's heavy hitter. He was its signal flare, its nightlight, its target marker, and its chemical weapon. When the platoon needed anything to happen in the air more than 40 meters away, it happened because he made it happen. All of which sounds, so far, like a very good deal. Here is where it stops sounding like one. The high explosive round has a safety feature built into its fuse, and the safety feature is the reason some grenadiers still wake up at 3 in the morning. When the round travels down the rifled barrel, it starts spinning. That spin is what stabilizes it in flight, and the fuse designers used it as an arming mechanism. Centrifugal force from the spinning has to work against a spring-loaded safety inside the fuse for a certain number of revolutions before the firing train lines up and the round becomes live. In practical terms, the grenade has to fly somewhere between roughly 14 and 30 meters before it can explode. The logic is unarguable. You do not want a man to shoot a tree branch 8 feet in front of him and kill his own squad. Every grenade launcher ever built has some version of this. It is correct engineering. It is also, in the specific conditions of Vietnam, a trapdoor built into the floor of the squad's most powerful weapon. Because contact in that war did not usually start at 200 meters across an open field. It started when a point man walked into a bunker complex he could not see. It started at 8 meters, at 12 meters, at 15, in bamboo so thick you were pushing it apart with your hands. It started with an enemy soldier standing up out of the ground in front of you. And at that range, the grenadier's weapon is a paperweight. Not a bad weapon. Not a reduced effect weapon. It does not work. You can put the front blade sight square on a man's sternum at 10 meters, pull the trigger, and the round will leave the tube, cross the intervening space, and hit him like somebody threw a can of soup at him hard. It will bruise. It might crack a rib or open a wound. It will not detonate because it cannot detonate, because it has not spun enough yet. Then you are standing there holding an empty single-shot launcher in front of a man with an automatic rifle, and you have to break the action, extract the spent case, reach for another round, load it, close it, all while the fastest thing you can do to save yourself is drop the launcher entirely and go for a pistol. Grenadiers have their own name for these encounters, and it is unprintable. And this is not only a threat to the grenadier. Fired into brush, an unarmed round is not inert. It is a half-pound of steel traveling at speed with nothing controlling where it goes next. There are documented cases of rounds glancing off bamboo or a tree trunk at close range and coming back into the American position, striking friendly soldiers. Men were injured, seriously, by grenades their own squad mates fired that never exploded at all. The fuse that was designed to protect them from the blast delivered them a different injury instead, and there is no citation, no medal, and no comfortable story to be made out of that. Some grenadiers adapted by keeping a buckshot round chambered as their default load, so that if contact opened close they had one instant, unfused, catastrophic answer available. Which is a fine solution right up until contact opens at 200 meters instead, and now the squad's artillery is holding a shotgun. Every single day, that man had to guess which war he was about to be in. Now add the weight. A 40 millimeters high explosive round weighs a little over half a pound. That sounds like nothing. Multiply it. Grenadiers commonly carried between 40 and 100 rounds depending on the mission, and on a search and destroy operation or a long patrol into a known concentration, 100 was not unusual. Do the arithmetic and you get somewhere north of 50 pounds of live explosive ammunition, before you count the launcher, before the pistol and its magazines, before the scrounged rifle and its magazines, before water, before rations, before the poncho liner, and the entrenching tool, and the claymore and the extra belt of M60 ammunition that everybody in the squad carried for the machine gunner. The Army did not initially issue a good way to carry any of it. Grenadiers improvised. They used cotton bandoliers meant for other things, claymore bags, sandbags, canvas pouches sewn by Vietnamese tailors in the base camp villages, and eventually purpose-built vests with rows of individual loops across the chest and stomach. Photographs of grenadiers in the field from 1967 onward look genuinely strange, because the man is wearing a garment of grenades. 10 across the chest, 10 across the belly. More in bandoliers crossed over the shoulders like a Mexican revolutionary. More in the ruck. He is walking through mud and monsoon and elephant grass in 105 degrees at 90% humidity, wearing the contents of a small ammunition dump. And here is the part that gets underneath your skin. He knows what all of it does. He has watched what one round does to a bunker. He has 50 of them on his torso. And every step he takes through a country seeded with command-detonated mines and rigged artillery shells, he is carrying the possibility of his own complete disappearance strapped over his heart. The bandolier straps chafed. The vest cooked him. The weight ground his shoulders down until the calluses turned into something else. And unlike a rifleman, he could not just drop the load when contact started, because the load was the weapon. Which brings us to the last item in this arrangement, and the worst one. They wanted him dead first. This is not folklore. Viet Cong and North Vietnamese Army ambush doctrine was disciplined, taught, and reviewed after actions, and the sequencing of targets was part of the training. When you spring an ambush on an American patrol, you do not spray the column evenly. You kill the men whose absence breaks the unit fastest. The radio operator, because without the radio there is no artillery and no medevac and no gunships. The man with the map who looks like an officer. The medic. The machine gunner. And the man wearing the grenades. He was easy to identify from 100 meters. The silhouette gave him away. A short fat tube instead of a rifle, and that unmistakable pattern of rounds across the chest. So the grenadier walked with the knowledge that of all the young men in that file, he was the one being watched through the sights. He had a stripped-down pistol on his hip for the moment they came for him, and he had a 30-meter bubble around his own body, inside which his primary weapon would not function. And men still volunteered for it. That is what I keep coming back to. Squads had grenadiers who fought to keep the job when a replacement arrived who could have taken it. Some of them liked the weight of it. Some of them liked being the man who could end a firefight in one motion. And a lot of them, from the interviews and the memoirs, seemed to have kept it for a much simpler reason, which is that if they gave it up, somebody else in the squad would have to carry it, and they had gotten good at it, and being good at it kept people alive. 2 stories show what that looked like when it mattered most. The 31st of October, 1967. Binh Duong Province, near a hamlet called Ap Dong. Captain Riley Leroy Pitts, commanding Company C of the 2nd Battalion, 27th Infantry, 25th Infantry Division. He was 30 years old, from Oklahoma, a journalism graduate of Wichita State, married with 2 children, and he had about a month left on his tour. His company came in by helicopter and immediately took automatic weapons fire. Pitts led an assault straight into it and overran the positions. Then he was ordered to push north to reinforce another company that was heavily engaged, and as his men moved forward, the jungle opened up on them from 3 directions at once. 4 enemy bunkers. 2 of them within 15 meters of where Pitts was standing. His rifle was useless. That is the detail in the official record, and it deserves more attention than it usually gets. The foliage was so dense that rifle rounds were being eaten by vegetation before they reached anything. He was a company commander pinned in place with his men being shot and his weapon accomplishing nothing. So he picked up an M79 off the ground. It was not his. It had belonged to somebody who was no longer using it. And Captain Pitts, an infantry officer whose job that day was to command 100 men, began working the bunkers personally, 1 round at a time, breaking the action, loading, closing, firing, breaking the action again, putting high explosive through gaps in the jungle that rifle fire could not cross. At some point during this, a Chinese grenade taken from a captured enemy soldier's web gear came into his hands, and he threw it at the bunker in front of him. It struck the foliage, rebounded, and landed among his own men. Pitts threw his body on top of it. It did not go off. He got up. He kept fighting. He repositioned the company so friendly artillery could be brought in, and when the artillery lifted, he led them forward again. The jungle still blocked clean fire on the bunkers, so he moved to a position where he could put effective fire on them, which is a very tidy phrase for stepping somewhere with no cover on purpose, and there he was killed. Riley Pitts received the Medal of Honor posthumously, presented by President Johnson to his wife Eula and their 2 children in December of 1968. He was the first African-American commissioned officer in the history of the United States to receive it, and the weapon he used to hold his company together long enough for the rest of them to survive was a 6-pound break-open tube he found lying on the ground. The second story starts on the night of the 18th of June 1968, and it is the reason I think about the M79 differently than I used to. A 4-man long-range reconnaissance patrol, callsign Wildcat 2, was operating deep in enemy territory northeast of Saigon, near a hamlet called Ap Go Kong. 4 men: David Hill, Robert Elsner, William Cohen, Gerald Patty. Long-range recon teams did not carry the firepower of an infantry platoon because their entire survival strategy was not being found. They were found by something in the neighborhood of 100 enemy fighters, in the dark, with no moon and no stars. 2 Cobra gunships scrambled out of Pu Loi, led by a 26-year-old first lieutenant named Larry Taylor. Taylor got overhead, had the team mark themselves with flares, and then he and his wingman spent 45 minutes making low-level firing runs through heavy ground fire, working in the pitch black, trying to hold back a force that outnumbered the men on the ground by roughly 25-1. On the ground, that fight was being held together by volume. The team was shooting everything it had into a closing ring, and part of what it had was 40 millimeters. Everyone on a recon team carried rounds for the grenadier, because on a 4-man element the grenade launcher is not a specialty weapon, it is the entire fire support plan. Break, load, close, fire. Break, load, close, fire. Not aiming at individuals anymore. Just putting steel into the dark on every side, over and over, so that nobody could stand up and rush the position without going through an explosion first. That is what the M79 was actually for, not the movie moment where a bunker goes up. This. 4 men in a black field buying 5 more seconds, then 5 more, then 5 more. Above them, the Cobras ran out of ammunition. The Huey that was supposed to extract the team had its mission canceled. Taylor was told to return to base. He turned his radio off. He sent his wingman to fire his last minigun rounds along one flank and go home. Then Taylor flew his own gun runs down the other flank, and then he did something no attack helicopter pilot is supposed to do, because a Cobra is not built to carry anybody. It has 2 seats, one behind the other, and no cabin. He switched on his landing lights to pull the enemy's attention, told the team to move to a spot he picked, and he landed his gunship in the middle of the fight. The 4 of them came out of the dark and got onto the outside of the aircraft. They stood on the skids, they climbed onto the rocket pods and held on. And Larry Taylor lifted off with 4 men hanging off the sides of a helicopter and flew them out. All 4 survived. Taylor received a Silver Star for it in 1968. 55 years later, in September of 2023, that award was upgraded, and he received the Medal of Honor at the White House. He died the following February at 81. That is a pilot's story, and it deserves to be. But it does not happen if the men on the ground are overrun in the first 20 minutes. And the reason they were not overrun, in a black field, 80 miles behind the lines, outnumbered 25-1, is that a 4-man team pooled every 40 millimeters round they had, and one of them kept feeding them into a single-shot tube until help arrived. So that is what the weapon did in combat. Now the part that lasted longer than the war. Go back to the gap, the 2 seconds between the thump and whatever came after. Almost every other weapon in the American arsenal collapses cause and effect into a single instant. You fire a rifle and the round arrives essentially as you decide to send it. There is no interval, no waiting room, no time in which you are a person who has already done something but has not yet found out what. The mind gets no opportunity to observe itself. The M79 built that opportunity into the design. Thump. Then the round climbing, slow enough to follow with your eye. Then the silence. And in the silence, your brain, which has nothing else to do for the next 2 seconds, does the only thing brains do, which is think. It thinks. That is on its way now. It thinks, I cannot call it back. It thinks it is going to land in about 1.5 seconds, and whatever it lands on is already decided, and I am the one who decided it. Some men felt nothing in that gap. That is true, and it should be said plainly, because the myth that every soldier is secretly tormented is its own kind of disrespect. Plenty of grenadiers fired thousands of rounds, came home, went to work, raised families, and think about the M79 the way a carpenter thinks about a nail gun. It was a tool. It kept their friends alive. That is the end of the sentence for them. But others carried that 2-second window home in their luggage, and it never came out. Here's what makes it particular. The M79 killed at a distance you could not see across. That was the whole point of it. You fired at a tree line, a bunker aperture, a bend in a trail, a muzzle flash, a grid reference somebody called out. The round went over the vegetation and came down on the other side, and you never saw what it came down on. You heard, though. That was the thing. You heard the crump, and then, depending on the day and the wind and how close it was, you heard what came after the crump. Sometimes nothing at all. Sometimes secondary explosions, which meant you had hit something worth hitting. Sometimes screaming, in a language you did not speak, from a person you never saw, who stopped screaming eventually. And then the patrol moved on. Often nobody ever swept the position. Nobody counted. Nobody told you. So the grenadier goes home carrying a specific and very strange kind of uncertainty. He does not know his number. He does not know if it is 0 or 40. He does not know whether the people on the other end of any given round were 19-year-old NVA regulars or a family that had crawled into a bunker under their own house, because that is what you did in that province when the Americans came. He fired at what he was told to fire at. The jungle absorbed the answer. Men who kill face to face carry something terrible, but at least it has edges. They know what happened. They can put it somewhere. The grenadier is left holding a question with no bottom to it, and a question with no bottom will keep a man awake at 70, the same way it kept him awake at 20. There is a phrase that has come into use over the last 2 decades for this: moral injury. And it is not the same thing as fear-based trauma. Moral injury is what happens when a person does, or witnesses, or fails to prevent something that violates their own moral sense, and then has to go on being themselves afterwards. It does not require that they did anything wrong. It only requires that some part of them cannot fully agree that it was right. The M79 was almost a machine for producing it. It made killing procedural. Break, load, close, fire. Adjust 25 meters. Break, load, close, fire. Grenadiers describe feeling less like a man in a fight and more like a person operating equipment, which is exactly what made them effective, and exactly what made it hard to metabolize later. It is much easier to live with something you can remember as combat than with something you remember as work. And the sound would not leave them alone. This comes up over and over in veterans' accounts, and it is the detail that stopped me cold when I first started reading about this weapon. It is not the explosion that comes back. It is the thump. Ask a former grenadier what set him off, and you will hear about a car door closing wrong, a book dropped flat on a hardwood floor, a nail gun in the next yard, a plastic bucket knocked over in a garage, something hollow and soft and low. And for a fraction of a second, he is not in Ohio in 1994. He is standing in elephant grass, with a launcher against his shoulder and a round in the air, waiting. Not for the impact, for the silence before it. There is one more piece of this that almost never gets discussed, and it is uglier than the rest. Not every round went off. Fuses failed. Rounds landed in deep paddy mud or soft water and buried themselves without detonating. In some conditions, the dud rate was significant, and across a decade of war with hundreds of thousands of launchers and millions of rounds, the arithmetic produces a number of unexploded 40mm grenades that is genuinely hard to think about. Some of them were recovered by the other side and turned into booby traps. Some of them sat in the ground and waited. They are still being found. Vietnamese farmers and children are still being killed and maimed by American and Vietnamese ordnance from that war, decades after the last helicopter left, in provinces where the fighting has been over longer than most of the victims have been alive. Which means that for some grenadiers, the round that failed to explode when they needed it most did eventually explode. Just later. Somewhere else. On somebody else. By 1969, the Army had moved to fix the fundamental awkwardness of the whole arrangement, which was that a squad's most powerful weapon required one of its members to give up being a rifleman. The first attempt was the XM148, an underbarrel launcher clamped beneath an M16. It was a mess. The trigger extended forward on a long bar that snagged on everything. The edges were sharp, and the thing needed constant attention. Troops disliked it, and it was pulled. The replacement was the M203, and the M203 worked. Aluminum tube, sliding barrel, mounted under the rifle's handguard. Now the grenadier had his M16 and his 40mm in one package, and the terrible trade was over. Most line units had converted by 1971. The M79 should have vanished at that point. Obsolete weapon, superseded, into the warehouses. It did not vanish because the men whose lives depended on precision would not give it up. The M79's dedicated barrel was longer, its sights were better, and its trigger was cleaner than a launcher bolted under a rifle, and every one of those things translates into hitting what you are aiming at. Special Forces and MACV-SOG reconnaissance teams kept them. They cut the barrels down and sawed off the stocks into pistol grips, producing a stubby thing they wore on the hip and drew like a horse pistol, meant for breaking contact when a team was compromised and needed to put an explosion between themselves and whatever was chasing them. They called them pirate guns. The Navy went further. For the SEALs, ordnance engineers at China Lake built a pump-action 40mm launcher, holding 3 rounds in a tube magazine plus 1 chambered, which meant a single man could put 4 grenades into the air in about 4 seconds. Only around 20 or 30 were ever made. The ones that survive are among the most sought-after weapons in American military collecting, and the reason they exist at all is that the men doing the most dangerous work in the war looked at the future and decided the past was more accurate. Roughly 350,000 M79s were built. They went to Grenada and Panama, to the Gulf, and turned up again in Afghanistan and Iraq in the hands of American special operators and a dozen other militaries who never saw a reason to stop. There are units carrying them right now. A weapon designed with 1950s slide rules is still, 65 years on, the most accurate way for one man on foot to put a grenade through a window at 100 meters. But the weapon was always the easy part of this story. It is a tube, a hinge, and a trigger. You could explain it to a 10-year-old in 5 minutes. The hard part was the man, the one who traded his rifle for a pistol and a half-hundredweight of high explosive worn like clothing, who walked through a country that wanted him dead, in a formation where he was the first name on the list, who could level a tree line at 300 meters and could not defend himself at 10, who spent 12 months learning a skill with no application anywhere on Earth outside that jungle, got on a plane, and came home to a country that mostly did not want to hear about it. He was 19. He was picked because a sergeant liked his throwing arm. And for the rest of his life, in a parking lot or a hardware store or a quiet room at 2 a.m, someone would drop something heavy and flat on a hard floor, and there it would be again. The thump. The arc. The silence. And in that silence, the thing he could never quite put down. Not the explosion, not the damage, but the small and permanent knowledge of what it feels like to have already done it, and to still be waiting to find out what it was.